Class is now in session 9, Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing game 65 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Anaheim Ducks, in which the Sharks have won 4-1. So a nice little victory here over an Anaheim Ducks team that has been struggling as of late. The Sharks' first couple of matchups against the Ducks did not go particularly well, as they were brought very close to victories, but the Sharks never could quite get that W over this team. So finally they managed to do so, and they do so in a rather impressive way here tonight. Now, this game did not start off well at all for the San Jose Sharks. Through the first 10 minutes or so of this game, it was all Anaheim all the time. However, you'll notice that in the first period, the only team to actually score a goal is the San Jose Sharks, and that came from Marc-Edouard Vlasic. Why is that? Because James Reimer came up massive for the Sharks 3, potentially even 4 times just in that first half of the first period. Otherwise, the Ducks would have likely been leading 2-0, 3-0, potentially even more than that. But because Reimer was there, he stood tall, the Sharks finally woke up and eventually would get a nice little Vlasic goal near the last few minutes of that first period to put themselves up 1-0. And from then on, the Sharks more or less took over. It wasn't insane dominance by the Sharks, but the Ducks definitely did not get as many chances in the latter 50 minutes of this game as they had in the first 10 minutes, which is obviously quite telling. In the second period, the Sharks would score the only goal of that one as well. That would come from Timo Meier, his 28th, and that would not be something that the Ducks would be stranger to in this game, as in the third period, while they would get one goal from Mayhew to cut the lead in half and make it 2-1, the Sharks would get another from Timo Meier, his 29th of the season on the power play, and then a third from Meier for the hat-trick, a beautiful goal by him for his 30th of the season. And the Sharks would end up taking the game 4-1, which brings us into the players to talk about. We once again have this top line. For basically everyone here that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to more or less ignore the first 10 minutes of this game where not a single player actually stood out in much of a positive light. Players like Barabanov and Meier, who had very, very strong games, had a pretty weak first 10 minutes, so it doesn't really do us any good to dwell on that part of the game, and we'll just look at the last 50. So when it comes to those, this first line was absolutely fantastic. Barabanov was making some slick passes and some nice stick handling maneuvers. Timo Meier was obviously scoring 3 goals in the game. Hertl was also feeding quite well. Generally, this line just looked like a well-oiled machine. There's a reason for why. Stats-wise, advanced stats-wise, this line was actually, though with somewhat limited minutes compared to other lines around the league, this line is actually one of the best in the entire league, not just generally on the San Jose Sharks. And it's just kind of crazy to watch Timo Meier this season. He matched his career high in terms of goals with 30 this year, and it should be noted the last time he had 30 goals was all the way back in the 18-19 season. That was 3 years ago, and the 18-19 San Jose Sharks were an absolutely stacked offensive team. It was difficult as a skilled player like Meier was to not get 30 goals on the amount of points that he did. So doing it this year when the Sharks are, night and day in terms of offense between those two seasons, they're an offensively anemic team at this point, is 10 times more impressive, I would say, than doing it those 3 years ago. So Meier clearly far and away having his best season, and you also can just compare it to last year where Meier just managed 12 goals through that year. Of course, it was a shortened season, so that 12 goals would have put him on pace for about 19, but 19 over a full 82 game season, or close to 82 games, as Meier missed a couple, compared to the 30 he has currently with still 17 games remaining. He could very easily hit the 35 goal mark and potentially even touch that 40 goal mark for absolutely the first time in his NHL career. Also currently sits at 65 points, over a point per game player at the moment, since he actually missed a few games this year as well. 65 points in the 60 games he has played, and just generally a fantastic year for Meier. On the second line, obviously a bit of a change because Logan Couture was actually injured for this one. I mentioned in my previous review that he took a puck to the midsection from a Brent Burns shot, and so as a day-to-day, I guess, caution. There's no reason to try and push him or anything like that, since the Sharks are not necessarily fighting for a playoff spot. So they hold him out for this game, and it is Nick Bonino who jumps up to the second line center position, and he will play with Noah Gregor and Rudolf Balcers. This line didn't really do all that much, which honestly isn't really that much of a surprise either. We have seen Bonino in the top six a couple of times already this season, and each time it doesn't work out. Now, before I criticized Bob Booner because there were technically better options, I don't think there really are many better options at this point to play in that second line center position. I don't think Reedy's doing it. I don't think the Sharks necessarily have any young players who could do it either. And so generally, it's kind of a you do it because you have to situation. And honestly, while Bonino didn't really contribute a ton offensively this game with his two line mates, they did have a couple of decent chances and also weren't terribly defensively. So at the very least, there were some okay things about it. When it comes to the third line, Bob Booner trended a bit younger with this trio, as Chmelevski was grouped with Reedy and John Leonard. Similar to the second line, they weren't terribly defensively, which for a younger line is good to see. And on top of that, while they did generate a couple of chances, Chmelevski had that nice move near the end of the third period. Leonard made a couple of decent plays, picked off a pass and gave himself a decent chance. Reedy was not too bad on the forecheck. Like I mentioned, it wasn't anything super impressive. Really, this game was just a strong team effort that wasn't super dominant, except for when the Sharks' first line was on the ice. In that case, it was extremely dominant on the ice. When it comes to the fourth line, surprisingly enough, with the reintroduction of Lane Peterson to the lineup, a player who I have been extremely critical of this season, we saw this sort of reuniting of Peterson, Gadjevich, and VL as a fourth line, which to me has just not really done anything at all this season, and they've been paired together a fair amount. But today, we have to give credit where credit is due. This was actually a relatively effective line for the San Jose Sharks. Obviously, they didn't score any goals, but they did certainly generate a couple of decent chances. They were mostly playing in the offensive zone. Lane Peterson seemed to have taken his demotion to the AHL to heart and is actually looking like a semi-effective player. There's this one particular play where he actually got back on the back check, which I was definitely very happy to see. And so generally, this fourth line, honestly not half bad for the Sharks. On the defensive side of things, the first player that we do have to mention, even if he does find himself currently on the third pairing, is of course Ryan Merkley. Last game I talked about how he had a very strong first period when he was paired with Erik Karlsson, but then was swapped with Vlasic for about the second period onward and just looked completely lost at that point, looked a step behind the game, was letting players get behind him, was making some poor pinches, and generally it was one of the sort of worse Merkley games that we have seen in a decent bit here. This game, however, was a complete 180 of that. Ryan Merkley was absolutely on top of his game, looked like potentially the Sharks' best and most offensively dynamic defenseman of the game here tonight, even more so than players like Erik Karlsson, who has been very strong on the offensive side of things at the very least over these past few games, as well as Brent Burns, who has also been somewhat better over these past couple of games. But Merkley just absolutely blew them out of the water multiple times, making some great plays. He would skate down from the blue line, stick handle players on the Ducks completely out of their jock straps. It was just absolutely amazing to watch him work his magic there. He fed Marc-Edouard Vlasic. I mean, just the fact that you're able to get Marc-Edouard Vlasic a goal should pretty much guarantee you a Norris vote, honestly, because it is extremely difficult to get him into a position to do that, and Merkley managed to do so. And then there were a couple of other times where he also fed some absolutely beautiful passes that just weren't ended up cashed in on. So generally, this was a great game for Merkley, and it's nice to see him finally take that step forward offensively. And I've mentioned that so many times this year. His defensive games in the games where he's actually played pretty well has not been too bad, but it's been on the offensive side of things that I've really been left lacking, where I'll see him grab a puck and then just kind of feed it to a different player with a simple pass, or just take a random shot on net that would get sometimes blocked. So finally, he seems to be taking sort of his his spot in the lineup into his own hands, and is going to make it basically impossible at this point for Bob Booner to take him out because of how fantastic this game was. Having said that, it should be noted that the NHL is a very fast-moving league, and now that they have seen him stick handle from the blue line down a few times, the scouting report is going to start to form, and teams are going to be much more aware that a player like Ryan Merkley is capable of such a play, and so it is not going to necessarily be as straightforward to do against other teams. And considering it is a move that can get punished, obviously if the puck is, let's say, taken away from you, a potential breakaway or 2-on-1 at that point could occur. Merkley does have to be slightly more selective when he goes for these types of moves, but I definitely do trust him to be able to read those plays well because he did so tonight. When it comes to the other defensemen, briefly mention a couple of them. Vlasic, maybe thanks to Ryan Merkley, actually looked a lot more serviceable here tonight, especially compared to last game. Erik Karlsson had a couple of nice offensive plays, but on the defensive side of things, continued to kind of struggle as of late. Big giveaway actually led to the Ducks' only goal of the game. And when it comes to the Sharks' first pairing, Brent Burns continues to be an actual sound defensive force, like he has been over these past couple of games for like the first time in the entirety of this season, so that is definitely cool to see. And finally, when it comes to James Reimer, an exceptional game from him to say the least. The first 10 minutes were entirely attributed to him for the reason why the Sharks still managed to remain tied at 0 in this game. It's kind of strange. I actually tweeted this out during the game that James Reimer could make every single possible high danger save, and then a random shot will come from like the top of the faceoff circle and he'll somehow let that in with zero traffic in front. Reimer's a bit weird like that, and this is not the first time that has happened this season, because this was indeed, I would say, a weak goal to Mayhew. But having said that, when you make all those high danger saves and you only let in a couple of low danger shots every once in a while, it is certainly much more sort of acceptable, and it's something that I'm much more willing to live with because of just how good Reimer is in every other facet of the game. So that was great to see. We do know, however, in the next game that it will likely be Kakkonen back into the net, so Reimer going to get a well-deserved rest. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday, so a bit of a break here before the Sharks take on the Arizona Coyotes once again. The Sharks had a pretty interesting matchup just a few days ago against the Coyotes, found themselves trailing quite late in the game by a score of 2-1 before eventually scoring 2 quick even-strength goals to bring it right back to a 3-2 Sharks lead and closed it out as such. So we'll see if the Sharks can once again take a couple points over the lowly Coyotes. Class dismissed.